Good evening, listeners. Welcome to another enlightening episode of The Lens, where we dig deep into the past, understand its impact on the present, and shape the future we're heading toward. I'm your host, Kaitana Davis, and today we're taking a critical look at a dark chapter in history that continues to influence modern society, and that is colonialism. From the expansion of empires to the exploitation of entire nations, colonialism reshaped the world in ways that are still felt today. As we explore the historical context, the people and the cultures affected, we'll discuss how this system of domination spread across continents, the long-lasting legacies that it left behind, and how former colonies are navigating the road to recovery and identity. So sit tight and let's take a closer look at how colonialism has shaped the world we live in through the lens of history, power, and resistance. Well, ladies and gentlemen, hi Ame.
Hello, Davis.
How you doing?
I'm well.
You're well as
yourself?
I'm doing good.
Awesome.
Really doing good. Well, as you had the introduction, let's first give a glimpse to our listeners what was colonialism,
And what colonialism is.
Yeah, and how it came into existence, into particularly our own continent, Africa.
Would you like to define it for them?
Yeah, well, colonialism, according to maybe our high school studies, is when a foreign country, which is specifically stronger,
Yes.
takes over and rules a weaker country. Yeah, that's different from conquering and invading.
Okay.
For colonialism, it's different. Yeah, people, those who conquer you,
All you want
it's more,
is
it's more of an
power,
annexation. No,
control.
they don't want power. They want your resources.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's so how it came to Africa. It was more of the, Africa has great resources
Yes,
and
that is very true.
yeah, and it has a rich culture. It has everything rich that the Europeans themselves didn't
Need.
have. Yeah, and did the chase of capitalism, and we have guys before colonialism, whites were in Africa. You know that we had whites in Africa before colonialism. There may be explorers, the missionaries,
Oh, yeah.
there were traders, there were everything. So while they saw in Africa, they had to go and tell their home government, say like, man,
What is there?
if we don't take this place,
We need to take it seriously.
we need to take it seriously. But then our ancestors, I think they didn't see the potential they had.
That is true. They didn't.
Yeah.
They were blind
So
to
what
it.
happens is this. The actual opening up of colonialism was, there was a time when Britain and Germany were fighting over colonies in Africa.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so Germany wanted to keep peace with Britain.
But wait,
Yeah.
before you go deeper, I have a question.
Yeah, sure, ask her.
When the Arabs came here
Mm-mm.
and did whatever they did, is that also considered colonialism?
No, that's not considered
Why
colonialism.
not? Just in
Arabs.
case somebody is listening.
Mm.
Because according to what we were taught in history class, they came as traders and whatsoever, things like that. They came to spread Islam.
Yeah.
However, their coming to this very date has had effects, especially in the northern part of Africa,
Yeah.
where these people don't look much like Africans and are more like people from the Middle East. So you are sure? So we cannot debate about Arabs being colonialists, air quotes?
Well, Arabs were not colonialists.
Why not? Did they not
Let me say
have some area, conquer some part for themselves? I don't mean a nation,
Yeah.
but they did mark territory.
Well, before colonialism, we had what we call the Ottoman Empire that stretched to northern Africa. That was more of an empire. But we realized Arabs also maybe governed places in West Africa, parts of Sudan, yeah, Somalia, all that stuff. But then the Arabs were more of colonizers. They were more of businessmen. But then, for them to do business, as you know, the Sharia law states, you do business with your fellow Muslim.
Okay.
Get my point?
So they had to convert us.
Yeah, so when they came, they had to do maybe the method that the Arabs used was not the same method the Europeans used, because those had Arabs in Uganda. Okay, particularly in Buganda, because they didn't extend to other
parts
areas.
of Uganda.
That's why you see most Muslims in Uganda are Baganda, and most Muslims in Uganda speak Luganda. They don't speak the local languages. They
Yeah.
speak Buganda. So they major settled in Buganda. Do you know why? Because that was their major area of trade.
Okay. And it was the most famed.
And it was the most famous. Of course, where there is business, where there's profits, that's where the Arabs settled.
Yeah. They
So,
found most interesting.
When they came to convert us to do everything, their motive was not to rule you guys. Because if they wanted to rule, they would have ruled, by the way. But that's not their motive. Their motive was maybe to spread Islam
And to trade.
and even participate in slave trade, all that.
Okay. I'll
But
buy
for the
that.
Europeans, they had, for example, the French used what they call the assimilation policy,
Oh, yeah.
whereby you're all French but in black skins.
Oh, yeah. Just be like us.
Yeah, there was time in France whereby 70% of the
Of the
parliament,
team.
of the parliament
Uh-huh.
in the 1950s were blacks
Just like the football team.
and the
at some
football
point.
team. So
Yeah.
that's what they call assimilation. But for the football team, it's different, whereby they give you citizenship and you read the French. You have to abandon your home country and you can become French. That's a different way.
Would you do that?
Yeah, kind of. If it's money, then. But well, differently, we shall specify in Ghana, whereby, in fact, independence and also the Ethiopian defeat of the Italians in 1941,
Okay.
also a great achievement. So these inspired, but colonialism had effects. This is in Africa.
And that's the causes.
Yeah, not the causes on how. That's different. There's why and how.
Okay.
So how it came to existence, how did it happen that colonialism came to Africa?
Sure, take us through it.
Yeah, it starts by the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885, whereby these all the European statesmen gathered in Berlin, the capital city of Germany, to share Africa into equal parts. You know why France was given one of the biggest shares? Because
Why?
France had the biggest share on the African countries. The whole of West Africa was French, apart from Ghana, Nigeria, and Cameroon. No, Cameroon was also French. Then Madagascar was also French. You also have parts of Morocco, Libya, Tunisia. Those were also French. No, Libya was Italian, I guess. Yeah, all that. Egyptian was British. So, what happens is the French wanted to be diverted by the Germans to not concentrate on Alsace and Lorraine. Alsace and Lorraine were French territories that were taken away from them by the Germans under Otto von Bismarck during the unification struggles in 1871. And those territories were rich in coal and iron ore. So what the Germans did, the Germans being the chairman of that conference, they decided to give France a bigger share, and the Germans took the smallest share. So which made France happy that Germans taking the share. But when the Germans had their own motive of controlling those two territories, maybe controlling some, because if you realize the German states in Africa, they were really, they're not really productive. Tanganyika, Namibia, and Togo, they're not really productive. Yeah, so that's how colonialism came to Africa, and it continues. And I think even up to today, we still face colonialism. Well,
Just in another form.
Yeah.
Once you mentioned the Berlin Conference, I couldn't help but think about my history teacher.
Yeah,
These people actually did a very good job.
yeah, because
It's been so long, but we can remember facts like this.
of course
Take
you have
us
to know where you
in,
came from,
yeah.
the reason why this is happening. Yeah, so let's go for a short break, and we'll bring back to you, Esther. You have to talk to us about the causes of colonialism, specifically in our beloved continent, Africa.
Oh, yes.
Hello, my name is Trevor Getz. I'm a professor of African history at San Francisco State University. And I'm here in Ghana in West Africa to talk to two historians, Ato Quayson and Jennifer Hart, about colonialism. Before 1874, this entire region was made up of independent states and self-ruling communities. Then in that year, the British declared that this region would be the Gold Coast colony. And in the next 2 decades, they pushed deep into the interior. I'm interested in how colonialism operated and how it felt to be colonized. It seems to me that colonialism was a lot about control, about the colonial authorities getting to be in charge of what happened and make things work the way they wanted to work. How did that feel? How did local people react? I'm going to be talking to Professor Quayson and Professor Hart about what colonialism was like in certain situations and get a picture for all of Ghana. And we'll see whether we can use that information to get a better sense of colonialism and how it operated around the world. We're standing on this very loud street in Jamestown, and there's this big blue official-looking building behind us. What is this building?
Well, this building is the Customs House. The Customs House built in 1926. And the Customs House was used to collect taxes on imported goods. All imported goods had to pass through here. The officials who would assess the taxes on the goods.
So this is one of the ways that the British colonial administration made their money.
A lot of it, actually, a lot of it. The thing is that this building is not far from the old harbor. And the harbor was a shallow water harbor. So the ships had to dock 3 miles out at sea, and the goods would be carried in and out on canoes of different sizes. But everything was carried on the canoes. Pianos, entire pianos were brought in via the canoes, cars, vehicles, spare parts. The parts were all brought in. Alcohol, cases of alcohol. And then in the other direction, salt was exported, meat, gold, ivory, all kinds
palm
of
oil.
Palm oil, lots of palm oil was also sent to the other, but all on the canoes.
So from the British point of view, the customs help financially collect money, and second to control what's coming in and out.
Absolutely.
Now, did Ghanaians, especially these canoemen and others working, did they just accept this?
Well, there are lots of stories, but one of the ones that I found out is that because everything was brought in on the canoes, as I mentioned, car parts, pianos, it wasn't unusual or unknown for the canoemen to drop a crate of, say, whiskey or alcohol into the sea. And at night, they would go back and go and fetch it. So what they did was that they dumped some of the goods into the sea and then went and then took them at night and then used it for themselves. But alcohol was the favorite.
Sure. So in a way, this is a kind of resistance. But really, it's just them trying to use the system to get what they wanted.
Yeah, they didn't have the money. They were just laborers. So how do they benefit from this upsurge of material wealth that is flowing into the colony?
They find a way to divert a little bit,
and they take it.
Jennifer, where are we?
We are in La, as some people know it as Labadi, which is a suburb of Accra. And we're sitting in the offices of the Law Drivers Union. It's a branch of the GPRT, the Ghana Private Road Transport Union, which is the largest union in the country of drivers and transport owners.
So what was this place like before colonialism?
So this place was a relatively small suburb. It was considered pretty far from Accra. Today it's really close, and part of the city. But at that time it was a pretty big distance because people would have to walk between here and there.
So when the colonial system came into effect in the 1870s, it seems to me that the British had this port then that they controlled, Accra, and they wanted to move things out, right? I mean, that was a large part of the point of colonialism, was to move out all these goods coming in from the interior to Accra. So what was their plan? How did they plan to move things efficiently and make money off of them?
Mm-hmm. So in Britain itself, moving things was primarily done through the railway. And the railway had kind of grown hand in hand with the growth of industrial capitalism. So the development of factories and the discovery of coal. So when the British came to Africa, they saw this as an important technology. The British kind of prided themselves on their railways. But it was also a very easy, kind of centralized means of controlling the flow of goods and people around the countryside. By the beginning of the 20th century, they started building railroads, first into the mining areas, and then about a decade or two later in the 1920s into the cocoa growing areas. And their goal was to try to control the movement of produce or primary materials like gold from the interior to the coast so that they could maximize the amount of money that they could profit off of and control the kind of access to and flow of goods.
Okay, so there's a pre-colonial system, and then the British come along, and they want everybody to use the railroads that they can benefit from. And then what do Ghanaians do? Do Ghanaians say, yeah, we'll just use the railroads?
No, Ghanaian farmers were extremely resistant to using British railways for various reasons. Unlike other parts of the continent, Ghanaians or Africans in the Gold Coast had control of land and were the primary producers of cash crops, particularly cash crops like cocoa and palm nuts. And so they had access to capital, they had control of the market in various really important ways. They wanted to control their produce all the way to the coast so that they could get the highest profit possible, selling it directly to the exporters at coastal ports. The British, by contrast, wanted them to just take it to the nearest railway terminus and sell it to local agents in the interior where they would get a lower profit. So they weren't interested in that at all. So instead, they would in some cases bypass the colonial railways using hid carriers, but increasingly, by the 1920s and 1930s, started investing some of the profits of their cocoa farming in lorries. And so they started purchasing lorries, hiring or finding young men and their families to drive the lorries and then transporting the goods themselves, using those, in many cases, those same footpaths that carriers had used before, just using this new technology.
I know that today in Ghana, a lot of people travel by taxi or by trotro, which is a minibus that people can pick up and drop off of. How did that industry start?
Trotros emerge also because of this lack of access to vehicles in the city. But what we see is, these men come in from the eastern interior, they would be carrying goods, and they market women, and women are the primary traders in Ghana. They would see them standing on the roadside with their goods. There was a municipal bus system at the time, but those buses were very small, and they didn't have a lot of storage space. And so they weren't very convenient for traders. Lorry drivers would stop on the side of the road and pick up these women who really liked the idea of being able to travel in a lorry because it provided a lot more cargo space, and it was much more flexible, and it took them directly to the lorry park, which was right by the market where they were trading.
So what I'm hearing from you is essentially that the British colonial model was to have a centralized bus system, to have a state-run railroad system, and Ghanaians didn't find these things useful, and so they kind of built their own transportation systems to try to get what they needed instead.
Yeah, and the British found this incredibly challenging, right? So they actually call these lorries pirate passenger lorries.
Pirates?
Yes, I know, right? So we think about pirates in terms of like Pirates of the Caribbean, right? And they're these kind of almost cartoonish figures. But in the colonial period all over the world, the British in particular, and the French and other European colonial powers were very concerned about piracy. To call somebody a pirate is not just a kind of name you give to somebody who's on a ship or somebody who looks a certain way or wears certain kinds of clothes, right? It is a reflection of that person's undermining of authority.
So we're here in Holy Trinity Anglican Church, which was built in 1894 here in Jamestown. You know, I look around this church, it's amazing. It's a very English-looking church in the middle of Ghana.
Yeah.
And one of the most amazing things is these plaques that are on the walls to those who died. And I'm just noticing there's a dale over there, there's a pine over there, there's a Fraser. These are all Europeans. Where are the African plaques in this church?
The African plaques come later. From 1894 and well into the 20th century, the pews were segregated.
They were actually segregated?
They were actually segregated because it was the official colonial church. So for the colonial administration, all the senior colonial administrators attended church here. And because of the hierarchy that they established, the colonial officers sat in front and the African members sat behind them.
But then somewhat later, we do get plaques with Africans.
This is much later. And of course, the plaques for Africans are senior Africans who contribute to the church and so on. So the church becomes a microcosm of the colonial enterprise.
When I first began to explore colonialism in Ghana, I speculated that colonialism was really a question of authority. Just how in charge was the colonial administration? And to what degree could Ghanaians evade or resist what the colonial administration wanted to happen? And certainly we've seen both things over the past few days. We've seen ways in which the colonial administration could dominate the way that people moved goods or themselves. We've seen the way that colonial taxes dominated what came in and what went out. We've even seen the ways in which churches had hierarchies and segregation. But we've also witnessed the fact that Ghanaians could sometimes push back. They could be pirate taxis. They could force desegregation in the churches. They could lose and find, mysteriously, bits of cargo. So in the end, it sort of seems like there was a bit of a balance between colonial administration's ability to control them and their ability to do what they wanted. I wonder if that's true in other parts of the world as well.
Okay, you know, that was interesting.
Yeah.
After that, to an extent, I think I like, but not entirely,
Okay.
the French system of assimilation. They let us be us. Yes, they might have eroded our culture in a way because they
Let me
introduced
ask you a
theirs.
simple question
But
before you continue.
Mhm.
Do you know why most francophone countries in Africa don't speak their local languages? However, the local language from Senegal, from Gambia, from Burkina Faso,
I've not.
they speak French.
Yeah, but that's why I said to an extent
Yeah.
because the
So
British.
yeah, but the British at least they let us be as their own motive. Now, for example, let's come to Uganda,
Yeah.
where they colonized us. The British majorly used indirect rule. Their
Yeah.
job was to just get information from the African chiefs and kings and give it to them. But whereas we still kept our culture, we still spoke our languages, we still did everything in our own way, just that we had to report to them. But the French were to assimilation, whereby you're all French in black skin, and I don't support that. Anyways, if that's what you support, then
I said to
believe
an
that.
extent, not entirely. I said to an extent.
Yeah, but negative effects.
Yeah.
So Eme was
Proceeding,
yeah.
we are going to talk about the causes of colonialism.
Okay, go ahead.
At the beginning, Davis did mention that all they wanted, for some, they wanted the control, most wanted the resources.
Yeah.
But colonialism is more complex
Mm.
and multifaceted than we think,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons as to why the Europeans or the people from the outside
Mm. Yeah.
tried to gain and gained control over Africa was because they had economic, political, social, cultural, historical
Yeah.
intentions, you know.
I feel.
And economically speaking, they wanted the resources.
Mm-hmm.
That's top of the table. The Europeans sought to exploit the natural resources of other regions such as gold, silver, spices, and textiles. To this very day, Congo, for example,
Yeah.
is known to be one of Africa's richest
Country.
mineral sources. You understand?
Yeah, I understand that.
The Europeans also sought to trade and carry out commerce.
Mm-hmm.
I believe during this time it was after the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah, that's
Correct?
a
Yes.
revolution.
So they
Yeah.
did want the resources, but also they wanted to trade.
To trade. Yeah.
Yes, because what could beat a bigger market? You understand?
I understand.
They also wanted to invest. They invested in infrastructure such as ports,
Mm.
roads, railways to facilitate the extraction and the transportation of resources.
Yeah.
The most common, I believe, is Port Bell. You know Port Bell?
Yeah, I do.
Uganda?
I do.
Yeah, so it was one of their investments. Politically, they had imperial ambitions. They sought to expand their empires and to demonstrate their prowess
Mm-hmm.
and spread their influence. As we mentioned before, for the French, they wanted to assimilate, but still, once you identify as me or by me, it means you have submitted yourself
Yeah.
to somebody supreme. And for the British, they really wanted the power. You're under me, my minion, and
Yeah.
you'll do as I say. There was also nationalism
Mm.
and competition. Colonization was often driven by a desire to outdo rival powers and to demonstrate national superiority. That is why England, for a very long time, was known to be a very great nation.
Yeah.
It's because of all the states that were below it.
Below it. Yeah.
And when you come to Africa, England
Mhm.
was very powerful. It had, was it French or England that had most colonies?
French.
It was-
France
It was
had
France. Sorry,
yeah,
I beg your
France
pardon. It
had
was France that had
the most colonies in
yeah,
Africa.
unfolded by England. They also were strategic. They were looking for locations.
Mm-hmm.
And these colonies were established in strategic locations to secure military bases, naval ports, and trade routes,
Yeah.
given their interests. Socially,
Yeah.
they wanted to carry out missionary work. Most of the missionaries that we speak of to date were English,
Yeah. English.
and that is how. That is
That
how
Christianity
exactly.
came to Africa.
They also wanted cultural superiority.
Mm.
That goes back to the French,
Yeah.
their assimilation policies.
Yeah.
They were also scientifically curious. Colonization provided opportunities for scientific exploration, discovery, and the collection of data.
Yeah.
Now, historically, it was the it the age of exploration also caused colonization, and this was between the 15th and the 17th
Centuries.
century.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was one of the reasons as to why they came. And as I had mentioned earlier, the industrialization in Europe also
Yeah.
led
Yeah.
to colonialism, and lastly, the rise of nation states,
Yeah.
of which the consolidation of the national states in Europe created a competitive environment that drove colonization. Davis, what do you think? Would you like to add to what I have said?
Not really. Not really. Those I think were the driving cause. But to summarize everything into, let me say, into the three areas you said earlier: politically, social, and economically.
Yeah,
Politically, they came through. They wanted the power.
yeah.
Socially, was to spread their culture, which included Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
into everything that concerns European culture. And economically, was basically to trade. They wanted exchange for there, because being after the Industrial Revolution, there was demand for those raw materials to feed their home industry. So basically, they had to come and trade. But then they realized, why would we trade when we are ruling these guys? So it's we are ruling them, for everything there is ours.
That's
So
very true.
yeah, and which also compelled them to carry out the slave trade.
Yeah.
Anyways, back to that. I think now let's talk about the response to colonialism by Africans specifically. You see, for example, I want to really say this: Africans responded to colonialism in different ways.
Yeah, I believe they still are
Yeah,
responding
so
to date.
there was a time when the first secondary instance was the Ethiopian saga, when the Italians under Benito Amilcare Mussolini of Italy wanted to invade Ethiopia in 1935. So when he comes to Ethiopia, yes, of course, at first he defeats the Ethiopians in 1936, and he rules Ethiopia from 1936 to 1941. So I think due to the World War effects, the defeat, and maybe the Ethiopians wanting back their independence, the Ethiopians came up with a comeback and they defeated the Italians, so which gave Africans basically around the continent
Some sort of motivation.
motivation and more of like morale to carry out a rebellion against their colonial masters. Because you see, when these Europeans came at first, we saw them as maybe gods. We saw them as people superior to us, because perhaps you've been in this primitive way of life, and someone of a different skin color comes up, and then what do you expect? You expect, because he is holding a gun, you're fighting using pangas, and not even swords, you're using
Arrows.
pangas, axes, not even arrows, because I believe African arrows were not made of steel. The only steel product we made were maybe, I think, pangas and maybe hoes.
They would use
Before
iron.
colonialism, yeah, they used iron, but the only iron the only reason they made that iron was to carry out agricultural practices, not to fight wars.
But proceed. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, pangas are also used in agriculture, by the way. So it was more of a weapon. But due to the trade, because I told you earlier, European colonialism, before European colonialism, Europeans were already in Africa
Yeah.
trading. So maybe they'll trade up those swords, those guns, arrows, spears, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, so that's literally what happened. So when the Europeans came, guys were shooting at guns, you're running someone with your pang and someone shoots at you. So they're like, hey, these guys are strong. So we saw them as gods and we really bowed to them.
Talk about Maji.
All that stuff, you know what I'm saying? So after the First World War, basically, especially after the Second World War, whereby most Africans were exposed to other countries in Europe, because when they reached Europe, they were shocked. because they found poor Europeans more whereby they were poorer than them. They found whites who were struggling for a living. They found whites who sold themselves as prostitutes. They found whites who were really hungry. They found whites who were also against colonialism.
Mm-hmm.
They found whites who were also struggling with life, by the way. Really struggling with life. So that opened their eyes and they're like, we thought these guys were like, were like gods and what. So let's go back home and preach to our people about this. So when they came back home, they carried out nationalistic struggles, nationalistic movements. They formed political parties. They formed liberation movements to come up and motivate their people on how to fight colonialism. But the problem was, one, these nationalistic struggles were mainly centered in the urban centers.
Yeah.
Kampala, maybe Dar es Salaam, Nairobi, Lagos, Accra, Cairo. We have cities like Tripoli. So people in the rural areas who happen to be the majority didn't get didn't have a chance to explore those nationalistic struggles. So they're mainly in urban centers and they're mainly controlled by the elite, by the educated.
Yeah.
And maybe those, because when you're educated, your mind is open, you're exposed. And okay, you may not be like more of an exposed person, but your ideas are not the same as someone who has never gone to school.
That's very true.
So someone who has never gone to school is not affected by the way the British are treating them. Because I don't think the British reached the villages.
Mm-hmm.
As long as I eat and drink and sleep, what else do I want?
Mm-hmm. They don't really.
They don't really care. So I wake up in the morning, go to my farm, carry the agriculture, 5 p.m. And up to now, that's still happening.
That's true.
People are not affected by the governments going on. Maybe the only thing that affects them is selling their crops, the economy, like economic wise. But then it still doesn't show, because the village person, if he gets 500,000, he will still reinvest it in his beans and be like, let me buy another sack of beans and replant them, and maybe they can produce more money. So that was it. But then the African nationalists went again and struggled to reach those far rural areas. And they did that. They sponsored their children. They would come up with scholarships because the Europeans sponsored the first students, African students, to study abroad. It can be in England, it can be in France, or any other country. Just talk about it. But when they realized that they were literally the only educated people in Africa, they had to go back down and pick those African children who didn't get a chance to education and sponsor them abroad. So when they were educated, they came back and spread the ideals of colonialism, the evils of colonialism. And things went on, rebellions came on, but also the European colonizers had to respond by firing at them, suppressing all those rebellions. So after the Second World War, the European economy is in shambles, like due to the effects of the Second World War.
Yeah.
And there we raised two superpowers, the USA and the USSR, which had no colonies either in Africa.
Yeah.
USA supporting capitalism, USA supporting socialism. So the USA gave these Western countries money to look after their colonies, but USSR sponsored the African soldiers to fight against colonialism.
Yeah.
And in return, when you fight, you become socialist.
Mm-hmm.
So it was more of a cold war in Africa. But then the Americans also realized, if we don't fight against colonialism, one morning Africa will all be socialist. So they started also funding Africans. So they fight for independence. That's why after independence, almost all African countries were socialism. Were socialists.
Socialists, yeah.
Then after some time, there was a period whereby coups were taking place all over Africa. The 1971 coup in Uganda, we have the 1974 coup in Ethiopia, we have the 1966 coup in Ghana, we have the 69 coup in Libya. All those coups, when they took place, capitalism resumed. What we now know as neo-colonialism.
Yeah.
So, I guess we should go and have a short break. And Esther, after the short break, you will talk about the struggles Africans had after independence and why the whites eventually accepted to grant independence. Why they eventually, how comes these guys were really not willing to leave us, but at one point they were like, okay, let's give you. So what drove them to that?
Yeah.
So we'll have that after the short break.
years of independence from decades of European colonialism. One continent hungry for another's riches.
European imperialism in Africa set up the continent to be raped, its resources just sucked out.
The dreams of the independence era were to be short-lived.
The initial euphoria disappeared very, very quickly, within a year, maybe 2 years.
This is a story of mass exploitation, of the ecstasy of independence, and of how, with liberation, a new scramble for resources was born. Whether in bustling cities or remote villages, the 1880s and 90s were years of terrifying upheaval in Africa.
People were killed. Villages were destroyed. Political systems were completely destroyed. Leaders were arrested, put in jail.
Fleet upon fleet of foreign soldiers armed with new weaponry and a sense of entitlement descended as if overnight.
That was traumatizing.
This was a face of their European trading partners people had rarely seen. United in their cause but divided in their efforts, armed resistance failed. In the space of just 20 years, 90% of Africa was brought under European occupation. Europe had captured a continent.
Gunboat diplomacy. In many instances, the British did not actually have to go to war. Just the threats of war, the fact that there were all these big, powerful guns was enough to force the local chiefs to sign a treaty.
All this because of massive sea changes. Not in Africa itself, but in Europe, which was in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. The advent of the machine was transforming the continent into the workshop of the world. A workshop in need of raw materials. Palm and peanut oil would literally grease the engines of the revolution. Modern transportation would need rubber for tires, and Europe's prosperous middle classes now demanded luxuries from overseas. This was the dawn of industrial-scale production, modern capitalist economies, and mass international trade. Thanks to a generation of explorers and traders, the great powers knew what riches lay in Africa. Britain and France already controlled most of the continent's ports.
Africa had diamonds, it had gold, it had cobalt, it had lots of things. It had cocoa. It had lots of things that Europe needed.
But in the new industrial era, the value of Africa rocketed, not only for materials and strategic trade routes, but also as a market for the goods it now produced in bulk. Africa was an opportunity.
The Africans wanted to trade right from the word go. They wanted to sell their labor. From Malawi and northern Rhodesia, they used to go down into South Africa. You had a movement of people. People wanted to learn. They wanted to meet each other. So it was a natural thing that the outside world should get involved with Africa.
But the scramble for Africa wasn't just about economics. Colonialism had become the fast track to political supremacy in Europe. Britannia may have ruled the waves, but Germany was rising after victory in the Franco-Prussian War. Meanwhile, the defeated French Empire sought to regain its glory, and a new unified Italy was also growing in strength. Europe was a continent in the ascendancy, whose nations were vying for supremacy. And back in Africa, their competing imperial armies were pushing inland. And this looked set to bring them into major confrontation. The rival powers convened around a conference table in the German capital, and in February 1885 signed the Act of Berlin, an agreement to abolish slavery and allow free trade. But the act act also drew new borders on the map of Africa, awarding territory to each European power and turning trading partners into subjects of empire. It legalized the scramble for Africa.
What it did was it carved up what are thought to have been about between 6,000 and 10,000 political units in Africa, and they were then carved up, often cutting peoples in half, water tables just sort of cut off from their sources. It was complete geographical madness. Simply drew lines on the map, places where they had not even been yet. They had no idea what was there.
Africans were not aware that there were conferences being organized in Berlin to determine about them. No, they did not know about it. They only saw the consequences.
But the governments of Europe were at pains to stress that their forays into Africa weren't just the product of vested interest. That beneath train tracks and shipping lanes lay a moral justification which caught the public imagination.
And they justified it by saying that they were bringing civilization and Christianity to these benighted, primitive people.
The white man's burden, beautiful language. So the European politician and the theoretician of colonialism to explain to their people why should we send our children to Tonkin, the Gulf of Tonkin, to Vietnam? Why should we send them to die in the malaria-infested part of Algeria or Black Africa and so on? White man's burden. We have to bring them the light.
A partnership with the church in Africa offered the colonialists an insight into living conditions and the social services that would be expected of a supposedly benevolent empire. But it also delivered a moral pretext. Europe had long harbored an image of the dark continent, wild, exotic, and in need of enlightenment. For Christian missionaries and for many colonialists, their project was a humanitarian one.
I didn't see the colonial service as racist. After all, I'd come across real racism in southern Rhodesia and South Africa. Well, when I was at school in South Africa, I had no African friends. There was no contact between white people living in South Africa at that time and African people on a basis of equality. It was all master and servant. And these were the days of apartheid. I just could not accept the idea that every white man was superior to every black man. I knew that.
Well, welcome back from that short break, Esther. Yeah, video was really explained. I think the video really explained it all about the racism, about the ideals, about what Europeans really did behind the African back. So, Esther, if you don't mind, you could really explain to us about
the aftermath of colonialism.
The effects of that colonialism idea and what happened. What happened to Africans after independence, and why eventually the whites woke up one morning and they said, let's give independence to these Africans. So if you could take the lead.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just like the causes, African countries struggled economically, socially, and politically after colonialism.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges they faced was underdevelopment, because colonialism left many of them with weak economies, lacking in infrastructure, technology, and skilled labor.
Yeah.
This was because they were exploited heavily. Think of, I do not want to use, but yes, let me use it. Think of South Africa as an example. Yes, I know South Africa compared to very many African nations is doing well.
Yeah.
However, what if the Africans were giving in to themselves and not to the European nations? It would be England of its own today.
Yeah.
Another challenge was dependence on foreign aid. And I believe you will agree with me.
Yeah.
This is a challenge faced to date. because of colonialism, Africans have become very dependent. We have been taught and brainwashed to think that we cannot do anything by ourselves except when we are helped.
Yeah.
And this has been a tradition passed down to us.
Yeah.
I mean, we weren't there, but it is an ideology very many people have unfortunately bought.
Yeah.
The African natural resources were also heavily exploited. And this was because of the industrialization in Europe. They needed the raw materials, whatever they would get from Africa, they would take for themselves, especially the minerals. Socially, African states lost their cultural identity.
Yeah.
I will still relate to the French who assimilated the Africans.
Yeah.
It's very unfortunate. It would be nice to hear a Senegalese speak in their indigenous
Yeah, it's really
language.
hard.
It would be very nice, but because of colonialism, that will not happen. All they know is French, you know?
Yeah.
There is also an education and skills gap due to the lack of education and skills training during colonialism, which left a significant gap in human capital,
Yeah.
hindering development.
Yeah.
As you mentioned earlier on, they would only educate people that would add to them.
Yeah.
You're not adding to our government. We have no use for you. You're not important to us, so I invest in you. You understand?
Yeah. Yeah.
It was later on that they started to educate people, but also it was on condition. You either had to belong to a church, Christian, things like that. You understand?
Yeah, I feel.
They were also healthcare challenges because the African countries faced significant healthcare challenges, including inadequate infrastructure, shortage of medical professionals, and prevalence of diseases.
Yeah.
Again, they mostly only cared for themselves,
Yeah, of course they did. But
not us. You get that?
that's a good
Politically,
point. Yeah.
there was weak governance because colonialism left behind weak institutions, corrupt governance,
Yeah.
and authoritarian regimes which hindered democratic development.
Yeah.
Now, this one is something we can all testify about
Understand?
because Africa is known to have most of the corrupt nations worldwide.
Yeah.
Correct? And this is all because of what?
Right.
Colonialism.
Wait. I don't think you should blame colonialism. I have an idea
To an
here.
extent, of course.
Let me tell you something about corruption in Africa. Never blame a president for the poor welfare of the people. Blame the system. You know right now.
That is very correct.
You know right now.
I agree with you on that.
You know right now a cat can govern America. A dog can govern America. But a dog cannot. No, I'm giving an example. A dog, the difference between Trump, I'm not saying he's a dog, but the difference between Trump and a dog is just that Trump is human, a dog is a dog. But when Trump is in power, he comes up with these ideas you see on his whatever. When he comes up with those ideas, he doesn't immediately dictate them. He goes through a series of authorities.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? When money is being given to officials, it goes through series. So I don't think corruption is a result of colonial. Okay, yeah, it's partly, let me say like 20%, I guess. But the system is not what is right. Yeah, I mean, sorry for the intervention, but you can continue with yours.
Oh, I'm glad things did not escalate to where I thought they would.
No, they wouldn't.
Well, another challenge was neo-colonialism or modern day colonialism. Now, the foreign powers continue to exert influence over the African countries and undermine their sovereignty and independence. That you can tell for yourself. There was also a lot of conflict and instability, border disputes, ethnic tensions, and resource competition, which led to conflicts and instability, further hindering the development.
Yeah.
So all these have persisted to varying degrees, and African countries continue to grapple with the legacies of colonialism. Now, we are going to talk about why the colonialists eventually accepted to grant us the independence
Yeah.
we strived for. This was mostly due to international pressure. The UN played a crucial role in promoting decolonization and
That's really great.
self-determination
Yeah.
for the African countries. So we thank the UN for that.
Mm.
Another point is the Cold War rivalry. The
Yeah.
Soviet Union and the United States competed for influence in Africa, which led to increased pressure on
Yeah.
the colonial powers to grant us independence.
Mm.
Economically, the cost of colonialism,
Yeah.
it was weighing down on them.
Mm.
Maintaining colonial empires became increasingly expensive,
Yeah.
and colonial powers began to question the
Yeah.
economic benefits.
I feel
That was a very smart choice.
really smart.
And then the rise of African nationalism. The African nationalist movements, often backed by the international organizations, challenged colonial rule and demanded independence. And here we are.
Mm.
There were also moral and ethical considerations.
Yeah, really. Yeah, I understand.
Humanly, is this accepted?
Mm.
So the atrocities committed during colonialism, I beg your pardon, did I just pronounce that like that?
As well?
The atrocities
Atrocities.
committed during colonialism, such as forced labor,
Yeah.
land expropriation, and violence, became increasingly unacceptable. And that's why colonialism had to come to an end.
Yeah.
There was
really.
also a need for racial equality.
Of course, it had to be there.
So the struggle for the civil rights in the United States and the collapse of the fascist regimes in Europe contributed to a growing recognition of racial equality.
Yeah.
Lastly, they were military and strategic considerations. The World War II and the guerrilla warfare. The World War II definitely left them
Poor and what? Yeah.
exactly.
Economically bankrupt. I can say that way.
Yep. So they couldn't keep up with it. And that's all I had for you. You should know that these factors, combined with the growing momentum of African nationalist movements, ultimately led to the acceptance of African independence by the white colonial powers. And here we are today. Davis,
Well, then,
over to you.
I think right now we are going to talk about neocolonialism and how it's affecting Africans right now. Well, personally, neocolonialism is it's the indirect form of colonialism we are facing today, and it has had many manifestations. Number one, we are not speaking our local language as we speak right now. We are speaking a foreign language, which is English. And neocolonialism is not something bad, I guess. It's not something bad, but it really keeps Africans, basically Africans.
Why do you say it's not something bad?
Because it has really helped us in different ways. We've had education as a result of neocolonialism. Syllabus we are following is as a result of neocolonialism. You follow a British-based syllabus, not an African-based one. You know why? You study in English. You don't study in maybe an Ugandan language.
Now, may I ask you a
So that's
question?
it. Yeah, go ahead.
What is neocolonialism?
Yeah, that's what I'm explaining right now.
No. Just define it.
Yeah, I'm explaining. It's the indirect form of colonialism.
And then,
The word neo means new.
thank you.
So new colonialism is literally different from the old colonialism.
So, do you think you're right when you say it is good?
Yeah, it's good. Because everything has a positive side, and I didn't say it's good literally like full, like 100% good.
Okay, all
Yes,
right.
it's good. For example, we are right now following everything is not British made, but it can be European made or American made. That's neo-colonialism.
All right.
Yeah, because you're driving, they're Japanese made, they're not Ugandan made. So this neo-colonialism has, let me say, it has done more of babysitting us at the moment, whereby Africans don't think about ideas because everything they want is being brought to them by foreigners.
Yeah.
You want a guy, it's brought to you. These phones you're using at the highest derby, let me call it derby or rival in phones, the Samsung versus the iPhone.
Mm-hmm.
The Samsung is South Korean, the iPhone is American.
Mm-hmm.
So these are two, let me call them white people fighting, and Africans are also rivaling. Number two, I watch football. Yeah, I watch English football, specifically English. Those were our former colonial masters. That's also a manifestation of neocolonialism.
Yeah.
Football, someone kills a fellow just because Man United was defeated, or let's say that was the previous match where Man City was defeated by Nottingham Forest, and someone comes up, has stress, and okay, yeah, it has. There are causes of that. Maybe he placed a bet and he couldn't, it couldn't come out positive. So that's what I mean by neocolonialism. Listening to foreign music. So, and the biggest manifestation of neocolonialism we as Africans were facing was the foreign aid stuff. Because I believe the Europeans also listen to our music. Nigerian music, basically South African music. That's African. They watch African movies, basically Nigerian movies. We have also series from Egypt. Egyptian series, Egyptian drama, Turkish drama, Turkish movie Europe. So I don't say the entertainment part is more of a strong manifestation of neocolonialism. When we are watching the World Cup, if Cameroon is playing against England, the English are basically watching the Cameroonians, right?
Yeah.
And they're also watching the English. So that's basically it. But in the political point of view and in the economic point of view, neocolonialism has had a great negative impact on Africans.
That is very true.
Basically on the foreign aid part, whereby we rely on the foreign stronger powers to give us aid with restrictions attached. They give you money and they're like, we want this money to be used for this. And you know why they do that? Because African leaders themselves don't know how to use that money appropriately. We have many men who talk outside. We have many men who talk outside there who want to become presidents, and they're like, yo, when I become president, I think I'll change things. But you cannot change the system unless you don't want the system. Yeah, that's it. That's it. The policy, the system.
Yeah.
So, the reason they put these restrictions, one of the reasons is because they believe Africans don't know how to use that money appropriately. If you've seen, if you go to those Bank of Ugandan records and you see how many billions of dollars we've received in form of aid, it can be to improve the education structure, it can be to improve the agriculture sector, it can be to improve the entertainment sector, it can be to improve the transport sector, all that. Tell me how many good roads you see in Kampala. Apart from the flyover in Zambia, the expressway in Entebbe, the Mbara, the Masaka Mbara highway, that road that goes to Mbara. Northern bypass. I think when the airport they're building in home, of course, they have to make some developments around the airport. All that. But you don't see, we are not seeing roads being blocked in the center of the city. We see have potholes in the city. When it rains, it becomes a swimming pool. Well, I'm not degenerating the Ugandan government, but it's not only the Ugandan government that is doing this, but also other African governments specifically. If you see the developments of the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, he has really sacrificed everything for his country.
It's pretty neat.
Yeah, it being a small country, yeah, but he has done everything it takes to make a country at least seen everywhere. So, we believe that we can't live without the whites. And the moment you believe in yourself,
wrong, yeah.
the moment you wake up in the morning and you realize, even let's put it in the human perspective, in the human point of view. When you wake up in the morning and you you believe that you cannot live without someone, that's the first step of your own downfall. I'm putting it in a human point of view. I want our listeners to listen very well.
Yeah.
That this foreign aid is not only helping us. Yes, they give us billions of dollars, which can do anything. I believe $2 billion can change the face of Uganda right now. That's a lot of money.
That's very true.
But then where does it go to? I didn't know what causes that. How this started. Sorry for the interruption. How this started. When the Europeans were leaving, they left, when Africans were fighting for independence, there were political parties.
Yeah.
And those political parties were built along tribal lines, religious lines, maybe clan-wise, let's put it that way. For instance, in South Africa, despite the fact that there was apartheid, the Zulu formed their own political party. The Xhosa did the same. Despite the fact they were fighting one common enemy, who was the white man, the Boers.
Yeah.
But they still had to divide themselves. The same came to Uganda. We divided ourselves along tribal lines and religious lines, whereby the Anglicans in Uganda had UPC and the Catholics in Uganda had DP. The same goes to Ghana. So what kind of, I'm not going to, let me call it, what kind of foolishness is that? Yes, unity is power. Unity is really power. But you know you're fighting a common enemy and you have to divide yourself. So when the British saw that that was happening in Africa, they saw it as a chance because what they had done, they had completed their mission. They had come to divide and rule.
Yeah.
So when they divided and ruled according to religions and tribes, they left Africans in their own control. So like with any independence, they gave them petty constitution. For example, if you analyze the 1962 constitution of Uganda, it was really petty. How was the Kaka supposed to be the president but without executive powers?
Right.
Then the prime minister, who was under him, has executive powers. So they built this constitution just to divide us further.
That's very true.
And when they divide you further, they bring in their money. And they're like, we are financing your war, but use this money for this and this and this. So you fight your fellow African. And then the next day you see a white man as a hero. And you see your African as a
all we really need is a dependent mindset.
Yeah, well, it can't be...
independent, I beg your pardon, an independent mindset.
Yeah, it can't be... Of course, it has to begin with you. Because for you to change the world, you first have to lay your bed. That's a saying I grew up hearing. So, that's how neocolonialism happened. And then, let's first go to how it affected the Africans. Now, Africans have really been brainwashed. It can be in the religious... True. I'm sorry to say this. Don't quote me badly, especially in the religious perspective. Africans are following everyone. Someone starts up a church and is like, come for financial breakthrough. Where are you going to financially break through when you're not working? They still believe in manna coming from heaven, falling down. You're sleeping and you hear coins of 500 shillings falling on your roofs. You think that will happen?
I would rather we do not have that conversation.
No, I'm not saying it's... I'm not putting it in the wrong perspective. I'm saying it's an effect of neocolonialism. People have turned churches into businesses.
That is true.
And that's what I'm trying to... And in order to turn into a business, call someone and tell him you're going to earn money from this, and that's how they'll start following you. And that's why the Europeans are succeeding more than us, despite the fact they're running away from God. But they have that strong mindset. Work and God has to intervene in your works. That's one of the effects that it has. Actually, that effect has greatly affected our African brothers and sisters out there. The religious perspective. The second perspective is the business perspective. I want to start investing. I'm Ugandan. After my university, I want to go and live in the UK and set up a business in the UK. Forgetting that in the UK, the business you're going to start is already there. And there are many competitors.
It's going to be way harder, yeah.
But in Africa, we still have petty, the business industry, it is strong, but in some sectors, it's not strong yet. Take, for instance, our film industry. Someone wants to leave Uganda and he wants to act. When you meet someone who wants to be an actor in Uganda and you're like, where do you want to be? Like, what's your dream? He will tell you Hollywood. Because I think that's where the opportunity, because I don't think Bollywood will hire black actors. That's an Indian industry. I don't think the Chinese movie industry has black actors.
I've actually never seen one.
I don't think the Korean movie industry has actors. So the only chances can be Hollywood and maybe Nollywood. I think whereby Nollywood, the Nigerian population is big enough to fit in.
To accommodate it.
Yeah. So that leaves them with only a chance of Hollywood. Because being an American country, being a superpower, it's the land of opportunities. So someone decides want to act in America. You forget that there are better actors in America. You can be the best actor in Uganda. Start from Uganda, maybe those guys will see you and call you from there. That's what kills African mindset. We all think white things are good. Now, the third
We ignore what's
perspective
right here.
is the education sector. If you want to kill a nation, Esther, just destroy its education system. Everything will be in your hands. Believe me. You don't have to do anything big. In case you become president of this country and you see you want to control the country in your own hands, in the historical view, kill the education system. You know what Napoleon did in France? He abolished the teaching of all liberal subjects, history, philosophy, and literature. And he emphasized the teaching of science subjects, those subjects that keep your mind busy, not those subjects that keep your mind open. For instance, why are we studying European history when we have our African history in Uganda here?
Yeah.
Why are we studying economics in a white man's perspective instead of an African perspective? African economics, that is where I give you my phone and you give me your bag. Right. That's also economics, though at the micro point of view. You feel my point? African economics was more of communal. We have the same land, like it's a big piece of land. The family of, let's say, Mr. Lewis goes and digs there. My family will also carry agriculture. Your family does the same. Yeah. But more of European economics, it explains more of capitalism. What is mine is mine. Yeah. Competition. Yeah. So, that's the education sector we are facing right now. And you know why we don't understand the thing? Because the things are not in our DNA. They're European stuff. That's why sometimes you go to class and you don't really understand what they are teaching. And you're like, because it's not in your DNA.
What do you mean?
Like what I
in
mean.
Our DNA?
For example, because I did this right A level. When you're learning history, now let me give you an
example. You mean the history or?
No, all subjects. Now let me give you a good example. You're learning French, right? Someone writes. Do you know why you don't understand French purposely? French is not an African language, and there's no relation in terms with an African language. But a Spanish kid, a kid who speaks Spanish, you find it easy to learn French. Because I believe there are some words in French that are shared in Spanish, and there are some words in Spanish that are shared in French. That's the same with the English language. Right now, your language, it's easy for you to learn Acholi. I don't care whether there are words, but at least the dialect will still say the same. It's some of the same. It's easy for Louis to learn Etse, Lusoga, or Runyoro. It's easy to understand. Yes, you can. Even when you don't understand the language, when someone makes a statement, he said this. Yeah. But let a Chinese man come and make a statement in front of you. Even a Spanish kid make a statement in front of you. That's the same with economics. These things were made by Europeans, and maybe it came from their cultures, and they developed them. Because everything starts by culture, by the way. Culture is not the way we live; it's the way we make things. So bring them to Africa was really alien to Africans. That's why you see people in the Africans in the diaspora, black. They can be black American. Okay, let's say specifically now the Haitians, Haiti. Yeah. They seek out African practices. There's a region called Voodoo. It's a cult, which is 100% African. Because I'm not saying they are bad, but maybe they didn't understand what Christianity was all about. So they'll be like, okay, let's have their own culture, maybe. And that's the same thing with other Africans, other black Americans. Some of them still have African names. We have guys like Linda. Linda was an African name. It was an English name. Then the English called it Lindsay. That's an example. Yeah. We had names like Mara, Clara. All those were African names, basically from the ancient Tunisians. And so that's the point I was trying to talk about. So now the next segment, Esther, is yours. You're going to talk about how the government is really fighting all this I've just talked about, what the government is really doing, and just explain to our listeners that we still have hope to end all this and maybe get back to African heritage.
Africa.
Yeah.
Governments have mostly focused on promoting economic independence, regional integration, and self-determination.
Yeah.
As far as economic empowerment is concerned, they have diversified the economies, where many African countries are shifting their focus from single commodity economies to diversified economies, reducing dependence on foreign aid and investment. After the U.S. withdrew most of its aid, you've heard very many African leaders say this. It's about time. It's about time. Right. After U.S. withdrew its aid.
Mm-hmm.
Very many African leaders, in their own capacities, came out seconding the idea
Yeah.
because they said Africans have been very dependent for a very long time.
Yeah.
And it's about time they focus on themselves and see how best they can grow their economies.
Yeah.
So it is very true. The African nations have also promoted local industries. Uganda, for example,
Yeah.
the governments have implemented policies to support local industries such as textiles, manufacturing, and agriculture to reduce the reliance on foreign goods. Uganda is heavy on exporting whatever we have made here
Yeah. That's really nice.
to the outside countries.
Yeah.
Regionally, we have trade unions.
Yeah.
There is a body called the African Continental Free Trade Area, which aims to create single market for African countries, promote intra-African trade, and reduce dependence on the foreign markets. Similarly, there are regional economic communities like the West African states and East African community, which strengthen the regional integration and cooperation. There are also political and social measures which are strengthening institutions, cultural preservation, education and skills development. You could tell through the vocational institutes in Uganda. There are also international cooperation systems. For example, the South-South cooperation, where African countries are strengthening ties with other developing regions, such as Asia and Latin America, to promote mutual cooperation and development. They have also been reforming international economic systems, where our governments are advocating for reforms in the international economic systems, such as the World Trade Organization, to be able to address the imbalances and to promote fair trade practices. To sum that all up, these measures have demonstrated the commitment of the African governments to fighting neocolonialism and promoting economic independence, self-determination, and regional integration. Well, that is what I have for you today, Davis.
Oh, well, that's really nice. So, as we wind up, I would like us to check the comment sections. I see Louis with his crew were really here, arguing about, let's say, neocolonialism.
I saw a person, Philip, who says corruption, cry emojis.
And then he's saying, and then we also have another comment from Edina Nancha. I know, and it's funny how stats even show there are more over there than here in Africa.
Right.
Yeah, he means the prostitutes who are in Europe and in Africa. So, yeah, and Louis also says neocolonialism is not good in any slightest way. It's not good, but an extent it's good because some of us wouldn't be living because of neocolonialism. So as we wind up...
What do you mean you wouldn't be living?
I'm saying like living the life we are living right now. It's a product of neocolonialism.
Okay.
Yeah, so as we wind up, we would like to thank all our listeners for keeping up with us for all this time. And please subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the notification button for our daily updates on CBM Radio. So have a nice day. It's been nice to listen to you. I and Ame.